Felix Turner never imagined that a routine container scan at the docks would pull him into a deadly game of cat and mouse. Across the country, Detective Sarah Malik was racing against time to unravel a drug empire worth $45 million, one that moved through Britain's busiest ports with chilling precision. Their worlds were about to collide in a story of deception, power, and a criminal mastermind who seemed impossible to catch. Felixstowe, nestled on England's east coast, is a town most people overlook. It's not known for crime or chaos, but for its port, the largest container port in the country. Ships glide in from across the world, unloading goods ranging from clothing to electronics, all moving through customs like clockwork. Every day, thousands of containers pass through without a second glance, handled by machines and people who rarely question what they're moving. It's all about speed, efficiency, and staying on schedule. No one notices a few extra crates or odd paperwork if the job gets done. That's what made it the perfect place to hide something enormous. The first container that should have raised questions arrived on a rainy Wednesday morning. It was flagged by a junior clerk for having duplicate shipping numbers, an error that usually meant nothing more than a clerical oversight. The paperwork showed it came from the Netherlands, carrying machine parts. The clerk sent a routine request for inspection, but it was quietly overridden by a senior officer. The container was cleared and moved out within the hour. No one thought twice. Over the next 6 months, similar containers began showing up once or twice a week. They always came from different ports, Antwerp, Hamburg, even Le Havre, and always claimed to carry various forms of industrial equipment. Yet the paperwork followed a strange pattern: identical invoice layouts, similar typo styles, and nearly all were processed during late-night shifts. Security footage showed nondescript drivers picking up the containers quickly, always using vehicles registered under fake names. Inside those containers were millions of ecstasy pills, pressed into molds designed to look like parts of power tools or hidden inside tires. The operation wasn't flashy. There were no flashy shootouts or dramatic chases, just a slow, methodical poisoning of the streets. And all of it started in a place where no one was looking. The scale of the shipments, the sophistication of the concealment, and the total silence from customs officials created a perfect storm. Someone had figured out how to turn Britain's biggest port into the gateway of a drug empire, and for nearly a year it worked flawlessly, because no one suspected anything. Not yet. Redford was a name no one had heard, until it was too late. There were no mugshots, no criminal records, not even a confirmed birth certificate under that name. To most he didn't exist, but behind the scenes he was the architect of one of the most efficient drug trafficking operations in British history. His brilliance wasn't in brute force or flashy violence, it was in knowing how systems worked, and more importantly, how to break them quietly. Before turning to crime, Redford had worked in the shipping industry. For nearly a decade, he studied global logistics, container flow, customs procedures, and digital tracking systems. He understood how goods moved from port to port, how paperwork was processed, how ports were often overwhelmed and understaffed. He saw where corners were cut and where people stopped paying attention. It was in these quiet gaps that he saw opportunity. Using this knowledge, Redford built a system that mimicked legitimacy. Shell companies were formed in various countries, each with clean websites, registered offices, and digital invoices. Freight forwarders were hired, drivers were subcontracted, and accountants were brought in to wash the profits through real businesses. Everything looked normal on the surface. In fact, many of the companies actually shipped legal goods alongside the illegal ones, further blurring the line. Redford never communicated directly with anyone below the top tier of his organization. Instructions were passed through layers of middlemen, all using encrypted apps and burner phones that changed every week. Payments were made in cryptocurrency, often through mixers that erased transaction trails. He never reused shipping routes, never relied on a single port, and never made the same mistake twice. Every detail was calculated, every risk minimized. The authorities had no idea someone like him was out there. They were looking for gangs, violent dealers, and street-level chaos. Redford didn't fit the profile. He was educated, methodical and invisible. To him, ecstasy was a product no different from oil or coffee beans, just another commodity to move. While police focused on street busts and small-time seizures, Redford's network was pushing millions of pills across Europe each month, undetected. By the time they realized someone was orchestrating it all, he was already a ghost, deep in the shadows, watching his empire grow. Westbridge Exports Limited was the face of respectability. It had a polished website, a registered office in Birmingham, and a sales line that always rang during business hours. According to the company's filings, it specialized in automotive spare parts, batteries, engine mounts, transmission components. Nothing flashy, nothing that raised eyebrows. But beneath that surface was the nerve center of Redford's criminal empire. The brilliance of Westbridge lay in its dual purpose. It genuinely moved car parts, but only just enough to maintain credibility. Tucked in with the legitimate shipments, hidden inside carefully modified battery casings and brake drums were hundreds of thousands of ecstasy pills. Each container was a mixture of real and fake, making detection harder. X-rays revealed nothing unusual. The drugs were hidden inside rubberized shells designed to mimic the density of the actual components. The supply chain was complex by design. Westbridge worked with multiple logistics companies, none of which were aware of the full picture. Shipments were routed through secondary ports, smaller, less equipped to handle deep inspections. Rotterdam, Antwerp, Dublin, and even Klaipėda, in Lithuania, were used in rotation. Every few weeks the origin would change, the paperwork would vary slightly, and the receiving company in the UK would have a different name. Always a new shell that existed just long enough to collect the goods and disappear. Redford didn't just rely on concealment. He leveraged human behavior. Port workers were overworked and underpaid. A few £1,000s in cash, discreetly handed over in an envelope, could buy silence. Customs inspectors were rotated frequently, making it hard to detect patterns. Delays were rare, and when they occurred, forged documents or phantom phone calls from supposed government liaisons helped smooth things over. Westbridge operated undisturbed for over 18 months. During that time, it moved an estimated 45 million worth of ecstasy pills into the UK, most of which were quickly distributed across cities like Manchester, London, and Birmingham through a secondary network of trusted drivers and safe houses. The key to its success wasn't just stealth, it was consistency. Every part of the system was tested, measured, and refined until failure became almost impossible. To anyone on the outside, Westbridge was just another British export company. To those inside, it was the most important cog in a criminal machine no one yet understood. Alan Griffiths had been working at the Felixstowe docks for nearly 20 years. He wasn't remarkable, mid-40s, divorced, quiet, and generally overlooked. His job was repetitive. Log container arrivals, scan shipment codes, and move them on to customs or distribution. Like most dock workers, he didn't ask questions. But a string of bad decisions, gambling debts and a drinking problem, led to a quiet arrest one evening for stealing small electronics from outbound containers. Hoping to cut a deal and avoid prison, Griffiths started talking. He didn't know much, but he mentioned something that caught an investigator's attention. A series of containers that arrived late at night, always marked as urgent, always fast-tracked out of the port. What struck him as odd wasn't the cargo but the silence that surrounded them. No inspections, no random checks, just in and out, often picked up by unfamiliar drivers with strange accents and unmarked trucks. Initially, the tip seemed thin. The port handled thousands of containers weekly, and late-night arrivals weren't rare. But Griffiths recalled specific container codes that followed a pattern, a sequence that rotated but always ended in the same 3 digits. That detail gave investigators something to work with. They ran the codes through customs databases and found a troubling pattern. Multiple containers routed through different European ports, all cleared under various small UK companies that had no online presence and were registered to false addresses. Each had paperwork signed by the same handful of customs agents, all of whom worked odd hours or had recently left the service. The task force began to suspect something larger was at play. When they cross-checked the delivery vehicles tied to those shipments, they found that several of the license plates had been duplicated. Clones of legitimate trucks operating elsewhere in the country at the same time. Whoever was behind it had thought through every detail, down to the traffic cameras. Griffiths had no idea what he'd stumbled upon. His role was small and his knowledge was limited. But his confession cracked the door open. For the first time, investigators had a concrete thread to pull. What looked like a minor smuggling anomaly began to reveal the edges of a far more intricate operation, one that had gone unnoticed for far too long. Operation Latchkey was launched in silence. Only a small circle within the National Crime Agency knew its true scope. The goal wasn't to make arrests. Not yet. It was to understand how such a large-scale operation could move undetected through Britain's most secure ports. The discovery of cloned plates, shell companies and suspicious customs clearances suggested a system, not a coincidence. And says could be traced, if someone knew where to look. Investigators began by analyzing the container codes Griffiths had provided. A pattern emerged. Each code wasn't random, but followed a cryptic structure, hinting at a hidden scheduling system. A former cybersecurity analyst on the team cracked it in days. The last 5 characters of each code weren't part of the shipping company's format. They were identifiers for specific port staff who had been bribed or blackmailed. The system was assigning containers to handlers known to be compromised. But the breakthrough came when one container's journey was traced backward from London to Hamburg to Antwerp, and finally Rotterdam. At each stop, the same logistics software had processed its clearance. The software vendor was legitimate, but the installation in those ports had been quietly tampered with. Malware had been introduced, allowing someone to reroute containers, delay alerts and erase inspection logs remotely. Redford had done more than bribe people. He had taken control of the digital infrastructure. At the same time, forensic accountants followed the money. Shell companies, tied to Westbridge exports, showed a complex web of payments routed through cryptocurrencies, foreign banks, and fake invoices. One account in Malta received monthly deposits that matched the shipping schedule almost perfectly. The funds were then split across dozens of wallets before being converted to cash. Investigators realized they weren't chasing a drug gang. They were chasing a corporation, a criminal enterprise engineered with the discipline of a multinational business. Redford had built redundancy into every layer. If one port was compromised, another would activate. If a driver went missing, a backup route was already in place. Despite the mounting evidence, no names had surfaced. No faces, just data points, paper trails and silence. Redford remained invisible, and the operation was still active. Every hour that passed meant more pills on the streets, and more questions unanswered. The investigators realized quickly that speed was the key to Redford's success. Every shipment moved through the UK in under 18 hours. A narrow window that left little time for authorities to act. Once a container arrived at port, it was immediately transferred onto trucks and sent to secure warehouses or distribution hubs, often miles away from prying eyes. The rapid pace made traditional surveillance and checkpoints nearly useless. Detectives focused on tracking the trucks, but even there, Redford's team was one step ahead. The vehicles used were often stolen or rented under false identities, and the license plates were frequently swapped or cloned. GPS trackers were either removed or hacked to send false signals, showing trucks parked in one place while they were actually speeding across the countryside. It was a game of cat and mouse with no clear winner. Then, a breakthrough came when a local police unit in Kent stopped a suspicious van during a routine traffic check. The vehicle appeared ordinary, but thanks to an anonymous tip, officers searched it more thoroughly. Hidden beneath the floor panels was a secret compartment, small, tightly sealed, and expertly crafted. Inside were thousands of vacuum-sealed bags, filled with ecstasy pills, concealed beneath layers of insulation and false flooring. The street value of the haul was estimated at over $3 million. This find was the first concrete proof that linked the smuggling ring to a physical shipment, and it confirmed suspicions about how the drugs were being transported. But it also revealed how elusive Redford's network was. No drivers were caught at the scene, and the van's registration led to dead ends. The driver had vanished, leaving no trace. Despite this partial success, the task force knew they were only scratching the surface. For every intercepted shipment, dozens more slipped through undetected. The 18-hour window remained a daunting challenge, forcing investigators to rethink their strategies. Undercover operations and surveillance teams were deployed near ports and major highways, but the network's ability to change rates and schedules constantly made it nearly impossible to predict the next on a desk, still logged in. Surprisingly, it contained a treasure trove of data, emails, encrypted messages, invoices, and contact lists. For the first time, the task force had access to direct evidence of the network's communications. Despite Redford's attempts at digital security, this laptop was unencrypted, a rare mistake in an otherwise meticulously planned operation. Analysts began working around the clock to extract information. Names of shell companies, shipping routes, bribed officials, and cryptocurrency wallets were all laid bare. This breakthrough exposed the true scale of the trafficking ring and confirmed suspicions that the operation extended far beyond the UK. With this data, the investigators finally had the blueprint to dismantle the empire piece by piece. But they also realized the risk. Every move now could alert Redford that his fortress was under siege. The pressure to act swiftly had never been greater. As the investigation into the laptop's contents deepened, the task force uncovered something far more disturbing than anyone expected: corruption at the highest levels. Hidden within the encrypted messages and financial records were payments made not only to port workers and drivers but to government officials as well. The names and amounts were carefully documented, linking several individuals to bribes intended to stall inspections, manipulate customs data, and turn a blind eye to suspicious shipments. Among those implicated were 2 members of parliament, both with strong ties to the shipping and logistics industries. Their involvement shocked the nation. These were men trusted to uphold the law, now revealed to be complicit in facilitating one of the largest drug trafficking rings ever uncovered in the UK. Even more alarming was the discovery that one of the corrupted officials worked within the National Crime Agency itself, the very institution tasked with stopping crime like this. The media quickly caught wind of the revelations, sparking headlines that questioned the integrity of the entire government and law enforcement system. Public trust wavered as questions about how deep the corruption ran flooded newspapers and television reports. The scandal put enormous pressure on politicians to act, leading to resignations and calls for comprehensive investigations. For the task force, the corruption presented both a challenge and an opportunity. It explained how Redford's shipments continued undetected despite increased scrutiny, and why certain containers were mysteriously cleared without inspection. But it also meant they had to be cautious. Any leaks could tip off the traffickers and compromise the investigation. Despite the setbacks, the team pressed forward, using the corrupt officials' records to map out the chain of command within the trafficking ring. It became clear that Redford's influence extended well beyond the docks. His reach infiltrated boardrooms and government offices alike. The investigation shifted from just catching smugglers to dismantling a system riddled with deceit. Redford, however, remained elusive. With powerful allies protecting the operation, he was able to stay several steps ahead. The deeper the investigators dug, the more they realized this wasn't just about drugs. It was a battle against a hidden network woven into the very fabric of power. The fight to bring Redford to justice had become more complex and dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The trail to Redford finally led investigators beyond British shores, tracing a pattern of financial transactions and communications that pointed a luxury villa on the Croatian coast. Satellite images showed the property was heavily guarded, but appeared empty for weeks. When a joint task force arrived to search the villa, they found it completely abandoned. No sign of Redford or his associates. What they did discover, however, was something equally valuable: a large handwritten ledger hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the master bedroom. The ledger contained meticulous records of every shipment sent over the past 2 years. Each entry detailed container numbers, destinations, dates, amounts of ecstasy pills, and payments made to various officials and middlemen. The sheer volume was staggering. Millions of pills worth an estimated 45 million pounds moved through the network during that time. The ledger was a goldmine, exposing the complexity and scale of the operation in a way digital data never could. It revealed that Redford had carefully documented every transaction to maintain control and trust within his organization. The detail extended to notes on bribes paid, security lapses, and even potential threats from rival gangs. It was as if he had built his empire not just on secrecy, but on careful record-keeping. Despite this breakthrough, the absence of Redford himself was a bitter pill for investigators. It became clear he had anticipated the risk of capture and planned an escape route long before the authorities closed in. Intelligence suggested he may have fled to a country without extradition agreements, or was living under a new identity. The task force intensified efforts to track his movements, working with international agencies to monitor financial transfers and travel records. But every lead seemed to dry up. The man who had orchestrated one of the most sophisticated drug trafficking rings in history had vanished like a ghost. Still, the ledger provided a roadmap for dismantling the remaining parts of the network. Arrests and seizures followed, as investigators used the detailed information to target key players, disrupt shipments, and expose corrupt officials. Though Redford remained out of reach, his empire was beginning to crumble piece by piece. The discovery was a turning point, proof that even the most secretive criminal operations leave traces, but the hunt for Redford was far from over. After months of relentless surveillance and painstaking investigation, the authorities decided to take a different approach. Instead of intercepting and seizing shipments at the port, they allowed one container flagged by Dutch customs to proceed under close watch. This container followed the familiar pattern, coming from a lesser-known European port, labeled under a shell company with false paperwork, and loaded with seemingly ordinary industrial goods. The plan was risky. Letting a shipment pass meant thousands of ecstasy pills would enter the country, but it also meant finally catching those responsible in the act. As the container made its way to the London docks, multiple teams tracked every move, from the cranes unloading it, to the unmarked trucks picking it up, and then onto a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Inside the warehouse, law enforcement found no one. The place was eerily quiet, with rows of crates identical to the one just delivered. Hidden compartments and false bottoms were uncovered, all filled with millions of pills, enough to flood the streets for months. The scale was staggering. Among the crates, officers discovered something unexpected: a single photograph taped to a dusty filing cabinet. The image showed a man with sharp eyes, graying hair, and a stern expression. Experts analyzed the photo and linked it to previous intelligence reports. This was almost certainly Redford himself. His face had been altered over time, but the core features were recognizable. The discovery electrified the investigation. Redford was no longer just a name or shadow in documents. He was a real person, someone they could pursue. Yet the photograph was a double-edged sword. It showed a man who had somehow managed to evade capture for years, adapting changing identities and